Hi there, my name is Janice Nowakowski, and I am the District Teacher Consultant for Mathematics and Numeracy in the Richmond School District. Welcome to another burst session where we share high-yield mathematical instructional routines. This time we're sharing the routine of counting collections. Part of being a numeracy student is having strong mathematical foundations, and high-yield routines build both content and conceptual knowledge as well as mathematical competencies. Counting collections is a routine that was originally developed by researchers in the Cognitively Guided Instruction Project. It is based on social constructivist principles where students work together in partnerships to count a collection. So essentially, they receive a collection, they count it in different ways, and then they may be invited or want to record how they counted their collection and the quantities that they found. The materials that you need for counting collections are collections. You may gather those materials from around your classroom or storage rooms, or you might invite parents to donate items from their homes. Many teachers use Ziploc bags or zipper plastic bags, but you could also use cups or boxes or other containers. Think about your students and what they're able to open and close independently, because that's an important thing to consider when thinking about your vessel for your counting collections. On the right-hand side of the screen, you also see some tools, and those are support tools that are used to help students count in different ways. Think about counting in different groups. So little containers where they can put quantities of 2 or 3 or 4 of an item, 10 frames, 5 frames, 100 charts, etc. So here's an example in a grade 2-3 class at Diefenbaker Elementary, where pairs of students were invited to go and get a collection and then count it in a few different ways. And this partnership here chose corks. They decided to count by 5s. They started by stacking their 5s in towers, and those were tumbling down. So then they just moved to having them in groups. They counted them by 5s, figured out how many there were, and then recorded that on the math graffiti board, which I'll share with you in a minute. In the back left, you can see a pair of students that are using little cups, and they're putting 2 toothpicks in each cup. On the right-hand side at the top, you see an EA supporting 2 students as they count a collection of glass beads. So here's the math graffiti board. The teacher and I chose to use the whiteboard at the front of the classroom for students to come up and record what they counted, how many there were, and then the strategies that they used, and they could keep adding to that. In the same grade 2 and 3 class, you're going to, in any class, you're going to have a large range of where students are in their counting. So making sure that you have collections that, go along with the number or the quantity that students are comfortable counting and a bit above. In this class, this pair of students were counting stir sticks by 25s. So this was quite a large quantity of stir sticks, and they decided to group them by 25s for their counting collection. And this pair of students actually sorted their dinosaurs. Usually we really want to focus on students counting all and not sorting by color. In this case, it worked out because there were 3 of each color, so then they could then count by 3s. But that's something that we often have to talk about with students at the beginning, is to not worry about the color, just count all of them, the whole set, and making sure that count all language is incorporated into the routine. For these students, again, they recorded they had 24 dinosaurs, they counted by 3, and they tagged the math graffiti wall with their signatures. Another group counted the same collection, and one of the students didn't feel sort of fluent or confident with counting by 3s in her head, so she went and got a 100 chart that was available in the classroom, was laminated so that she could use a whiteboard marker on it to circle and count by 3s, and so she posted that as well to share that's how she counted by 3s. Another group in the same class didn't use any sort of supports or tools. They used the structure, though, of an array and rows of 10 to help them count their collection. And again, just an example of that math graffiti board in the grade 2-3 class. And what the teacher did at the end of our counting collection time was then she had the students sit on the carpet and say, what do you notice? What do you wonder? Here's our data from counting today. And she turned it into a data experience. What strategy was the most common? What did we count by the most? And why do you think that is? And do you notice something that makes you wonder about a particular collection that you might want to count next time? So some of those questions to bring that sort of the counting collection experience together at the end. This was in a K1 class at Diefenbaker. And again, you see some flowers and then students recording their count. So they use just blank pieces of paper on clipboards. And you can see the student on the left has drawn circles in each container. Again, talking with students, you don't need to draw the flowers and all the petals, just do something that represents that item. And she's got 2 circles in each container, and then she's labeled each one 2, 4, 6. Now, not each container has 2 or 4 or 6. She's included the skip counting, which is what we see is very common. Instead of saying 2, 2, 2, 2, 2, which represents the quantity. So, but this would be a very common way of students recording. On the right, you can see how the student has added the arrows to show the counting process, which makes it a little bit more clear. And as students share the different ways they record, they learn and pick up these things from other students as well. In the K1 class as well, this pair of students had quite a large collection of beads, and they counted them out by 5s, counted 5 beads into each little tart tin, and then started counting by 5s and got really stuck around they were on a roll until about 25, and then realized they didn't think they could count all the way up with 5s for their collection. And so this is where that, the teacher, paying attention and circulating and thinking about, oh, well, where can I nudge them? They're learning forward. And, so asking the students, well, is there another number you could count by that you feel more fluent with? And they said 10s. And she's like, well, how could you use, what you've already done with 5s to think about 10s? And the students chose to, they could have just dumped their tins together, but they chose to get plates and show that 2 5s makes a 10, and then count by 10s with that. So 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, and 71, that extra bead. And that's really important in collections, to not always have a quantity that is easily countable, by 2s, 5s, or 10s, that you have some extras in there to really support that development of counting on, which can be a very difficult concept for some students. And in that same class, after the strategy was shared with the tart tins, this pair of students did the same thing. They had been counting by 2s with paper clips, and then they put their little cups together in groups of 5 to make 5 2s or 10, and then we're able to count by 10s. So you can see where the connections to multiplication are starting to begin. Even though these students are in kindergarten and grade 1, that idea of grouping and multiplication is being developed through counting collections. And then at the end of the kindergarten and grade 1 class, pairs of students came up and shared what they counted, what strategies they used. They might share something interesting that came up or something new that they learned, but having that sharing and consolidation time at the end of counting collections. This is over at Brick House Elementary in a kindergarten class. And this was a student who was new to Canada and had very limited English language at this time, but he was able to recognize numbers or symbols. And so was partnered with a student that was fluent in English and had the 30 chart, of numbers as a support to connect the oral language of the number names with the symbols. And then, as a bridge to recording, having students record or print the numbers, having a collection of numerals or numbers for students to choose from to tag their counting collections with is really like that in kindergarten and grade 1 for students, again, who are bridging to their, written recording of symbols. So an example here, this is from General Curry Elementary, students counting 16 and then labeling it with the numbers. And again, this would be a great, opportunity for a student to take a photograph and then post to their e-portfolio, because it's, got the amount that they counted, it's got the symbol as well, so that it's a little bit more clear what was happening here besides just a collection of random materials. This is from a grade 1-2 class at McNeely Elementary. And again, just a math notebook, a blank sheet. The students labeled it with the, the collection that they counted, and then showed their different processes. And again, you get a sense of, how they counted, their ability to write numbers, what they counted by, etc. And then this is a recording form that I've created and is available on the district math blog. So what what was counted, how many, and that's a little box as an opportunity for maybe you ask the students to represent that number in 2 or 3 different ways. So standard form or expanded notation if you're working on place value, or with tally marks, just to again play with some of those number concepts in terms of representing numbers, and then showing how you counted. Student might divide that into 2 parts to show 2 different ways that they counted that collection. For intermediate counting collections, these are some of the number concepts that can be focused on. Counting collections is often thought as a primary routine, but there's so many math concepts and number concepts specifically that can be developed through counting collections, multiples and factors, fractions, decimals, and percentages, using coins and bills fluently, and then that really important concept of making connections between addition, counting, and multiplication. So here's just some examples with coins. You can see a mixed collection of toonies and loonies on the left. So they could, count by 2s and then count on by 1s. As students get older, it's also having them record their count, and maybe they could use equations to record this. So they might include brackets and do, let's see, there's 5 2s, so 5 times 2 in brackets, plus brackets 7 times 1, brackets equals. So 10 and 7 is 17, and then writing that as a formal symbolic equation. On the right, you see quarters loosely grouped into 4s. And again, this is an opportunity to count by 25s, knowing those benchmark numbers that 4 25s make 100. So we've got 350 cents. How could we write that in cent notation, in decimal notation, in dollar notation? What fractions could we use to represent this? So lots of different ways. Again, once they've done the counting, you can extend that in terms of criteria or expectations you have for what numbers you'd like them to record, or equations that you'd like them to record. Also, in intermediate, we want to play with different multiples and factors. So have a look in your storage cabinet, or, for school supplies or arts and crafts. And these were just some boxes that I found: 12, 24, 14, 175, 35, 80. You can pull some of those off the shelf, and that could be a collection. And then that bridges that mental math students as well as they're thinking about how to count up the total quantities that they have. You could also just use photographs or pictures of these if you don't actually have the actual materials. Also thinking about materials that you might have in your classroom. These are fraction circles. You might have fraction bars. So I just took a bunch of tenths out of the basket, and that could be a collection for students to count. And the unit fraction is a tenth. So you want to hear them counting by tenths: 1/10, 2/10, 3/10, 4/10, and that's developing that fractional language that's really important. And then thinking about how they could represent that quantity. So yes, there's 23 tenths. How else could we write that? So that's 2 wholes. So that's 2 and 3/10. How could we write that in decimals, an equivalent form? So again, lots of ways to extend with the different ways to record. This was that collection from the bag of 35 pom-poms. Not so difficult for an intermediate student to count, but you could challenge them to count it in 3 different multiples, for example. And then what I've had them do after they did the count by different multiples is then to sort by color and represent either ratios or using fractional, thinking about fractions. And you can see here there's a connection to equivalent fractions as well, for students to notice the factors that are connected to certain numbers, like 7 and 5 and 35 are related. So I should be able to create an equivalent fraction with 7/35, for example, or 5/35 as well. So, and again, you could have them do this on whiteboards and have, their counting collection sorted and out, and then the labeling on the whiteboard, take a photograph to post to their e-portfolio and annotate that as an example. You could also use clip art. I went on, Google Images and free, royalty-free, safe to use clip art. And here's some measuring cups and halves, because we want students to be counting by fractions and decimals as well in the intermediate grades. So how would you count this by halves? 1 half, 2 halves, 3 halves, 4 halves, 5 halves, 6 halves, 7 halves. And then how could you record that? Is there another way that you could record that? Is there a different way that you could count this? Could you group them into wholes and parts, etc.? What is the unit fraction that you're counting? So some other ways to extend, we've talked a lot about different ways of recording, but also math storytelling, problem posing, and making those math to math connections. So after students have done a counting collection, you might ask them and their partner to keep that last collection they just counted and then create a math story with it. So on the left, you can see we've got two pirates raiding an island and they're going to steal the other pirate's gold. And there was a whole math story going on about how many they would be able to carry back to their ship. And how many the other pirates would be left with. And then on the right, there's always great dinosaur stories that happen with counting collections as well. And then I often have seasonal counting collections that I bring out in different times of the year. I had some acrylic hearts and felt hearts around Valentine's Day, and those found their way into our math stories as well. And then math problem posing in the same vein. After they've counted a collection, use that last collection and think about how many you had. And so what would be a good problem to pose around that? What sort of story could I create? And of course, the gold coins are really popular for that. So here's, again, more pirates. And you can tell the students' personality. This is at Garden City Elementary, grade 1 and 2 class. Their personalities are coming into this. And then solving the problem within their math story. And then another problem posing as well from Garden City. Robbers and pirates, very hot topic, apparently. This is with the grade 3 and 4 class at Grower Elementary, and making that connection between counting and adding and multiplication. So on the bottom right, you see here students, had grouped them by sevens and then started counting by sevens. And then as they were in that process, realized that there was a connection between, skip counting by sevens and multiplication. And so having them make that connection as they're counting is super powerful and will likely stick with them because they did that through experience. And in that same grade 3-4 class, again, the students were counting by sevens, and they had so many of these little decorative balls that they decided, well, we know 7 times 10 is 70. So let's take 10 plates and separate them. And again, making that connection to multiplication. And they created a little 10 frame there. And then they knew they had 4 more sevens, and they know 2 sevens were 14. So 4 sevens would be 28. So it's all that application of those mental math strategies that you've been working on with them at that age. And so then 70 and 28 is much more efficient for them to add together than thinking about counting by sevens for all that large group of decorative balls. And these are often called Mardi Gras beads, and I buy them and I cut them into different multiples, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s, 8s, etc. And you can see here, students had 5s and they're like, oh, it'll be much faster if we group it by 10s. So they quickly put them into 10s to count. So again, making those connections between factors and multiples. So one of the reasons we do high yield instructional routines is because so many connections to our curriculum here in British Columbia. On the left-hand side, you see just some of the competencies that are developed during these routines. And on the right-hand side, some of the number concepts that are developed during counting collections. Really depends on what grade level that you're working with. And just some other, support materials, some picture books to support counting collections. Hannah's collection is a lovely picture book about a girl that loves to collect all sorts of things. And you see her bedroom with all these different collections in them. And you could just stop on a page and say, oh, look at all these books. What are the different ways we could count those? And have that discussion, as an introduction to your lesson on counting collections. In the middle, 2 Ways to Count to 10 is a classic math picture book. It's just a playful way to think about, what are the different ways we could count? 2s, 5s, 10s, 1s, etc. And then Bruce Goldstone's books, Great Estimations and Greater Estimations, are both excellent books to teach some specific strategies around estimating that use reasoning. And that's something, estimating is something you can build into the counting collection routine after students are, more comfortable with what the expectations are. So, adding in that idea, okay, you've got your collection, have a look at the bag now. About how many do you think there are? It could be, a more precise estimate, like, oh, I think there's 23, or you could use a range, like, oh, I think it's between 20 and 25 to develop that sense of that estimating. Doesn't have to be exact. It could be sort of about that idea. Taking counting collections outdoors, you see these students gathered some bundles of sticks and then they grouped them in different ways and circled them with sidewalk chalk and counted, or using 10 frames to help them count. And then finding things that are naturally occurring in groups outside, like buttercup petals, 5, counting by 5s, or clovers, counting by 3s. And then recording your count, sidewalk chalk or notebooks or clipboards. And then some key resources for counting collections. Choral counting and counting collections is a resource that's been out for a few years. It should be in most of your professional libraries and schools. And again, draws on the work of cognitively guided instruction. And then on the right, from the University of Washington, their teacher education department has a great website with all sorts of support materials for instructional routines, but that's the link specifically for counting collections. And in Richmond, we have several blog posts about counting collections on the district math blog and resources on the portal, including these posters in English, et en français, for you to put up in your classroom or in the foyer, or post, a batch post on Scalantis for parents to be familiar about what counting collections are and for them to think about doing that at home as well. So just as we end this session, I'd like you to think about how will you use this high yield instructional routine with your students. And thank you for joining me.